This is the second video in our two-part series on how we removed and replaced the engine in our 2007 Chevy Express van. After determining that we needed a new engine, we got on the phone and the internet and searched around for new, used, and remanufactured engines. The price difference between a used and a remanufactured engine wasn't much. We went with the remanufactured one with the warranty. Because our van is a 1-ton, the warranty is 18 months or 100,000 miles. If it was a half-ton or 3/4 ton, it would be 300,000 miles and a 3-year warranty. It was delivered to our house, and we are excited to open it up and take a look at it. Now, before we put this engine into this hole, we have a lot of work to do on this old block. And it starts by removing every bracket, every bolt, every plug, every sensor, exhaust manifold. Here I'm removing the valve covers. Every time I took a piece off, I would clean it up in the parts cleaner to make sure it looked good before putting it on the new engine. I'll clean the mating surfaces, install new gaskets, and then torque down to the proper specs. Take your time with this step. I installed the oil cooler lines and I was 1 bolt hole off. It made installation of the engine a little more challenging. Here I am moving the crankshaft position sensor over to the new block. After torquing down the flywheel bolts to 74 foot-pounds and installing new spark plugs, the fun part began. We lifted the engine up, carefully moved it into place, and here you can see us fighting with the oil cooler lines that didn't line up. The alignment pins fitted perfect after using a floor jack to lift the transmission up. Next, I crawled under the van and installed the 15mm bell housing bolts. There's 2 on the right side, there's 2 on the left side, and then there are 2 on the top, 1 right here and 1 right here. To secure the engine to the frame, I installed the 6 15mm motor mount bolts. There are 3 on the right side and 3 on the left side. Then I crawled back under the van and mated the flywheel to the torque converter. The torque converter should spin freely without any bolts in there. There are a total of 6 bolts holding it in. You'll have to manually move the flywheel, reinstall another bolt, and then each bolt should be torqued down to 44 foot-pounds. Before installing the starter, I used some sandpaper to clean off the terminals. I also cleaned the old starter. I was a little too aggressive when I was torquing down a bolt. I broke the brittle plastic. After returning from the parts store, I lifted the new starter in place. I attached the 2 terminals on the back of the starter, but before bolting it in, I grabbed the wire harness for the crankshaft position sensor and clicked that into place. I also grabbed the wire harness for the oil level sending unit and attached that. The starter is then attached with 2 long 13mm bolts that go into the block. The next thing I did was work the torque converter cover into place. After I worked it in there, I was able to install these 6 15mm bolts that secure it. There is a 10mm bolt that holds a bracket on. This bracket holds the wire harness and the transmission oil cooler lines on. After getting the wire harness on there, you can click the transmission lines into place. Excessive exhaust back pressure will cause a lot of heat in the engine, leading to early detonation. This will void a lot of the warranties on remanufactured engines. We got around this by installing new catalytic converters. After installing the exhaust system, I removed the paint with some paint thinner around the mating surface of the oil filter. To help prime the system, I filled a brand new oil filter with oil and then crawled underneath to install it, only to discover that it does not fit. This engine block is from a 2006 Chevy and mine is a 2007, and they somehow switched oil filters from year to year. Went up to the parts store, grabbed another oil filter, did the same thing, and voila, it fits perfect. Also, to help prime the oil system, a plug is removed from the right side of the block. A 3/8 inch hose is placed into that plug, and then oil is poured down this hole. This will fill up the right side of the oil pump with oil. And now moving to the top of the engine, I cleaned up the valley cover and then installed new seals that go around each knock sensor. The mating surface cleaned with solvent, and then a new valley cover gasket was installed. Then I pressed in the new seals around the pedestals of the block. Starting in the center and working my way out, I I torqued each one of these 10mm bolts to 18 foot-pounds. Using a 7/8 inch socket, I torqued down the knock sensors to 15 foot-pounds. After using a multimeter, I inspected the wire harness of the knock sensor. After determining that was good, I clicked each harness into place, and then I used a little bit of RTV silicone around the top of each plug. Now moving on to the intake manifold. I used a simple degreaser and some water to clean it up. After removing the 4 8mm bolts that attach the fuel rail to the intake manifold, I was able to slowly and carefully pry up on each injector port until eventually the entire fuel rail was able to pop right off. This is not a necessary step, but with the new engine, I wanted to make sure that everything was running properly. I removed the clips that held each injector in place, then I lifted up and pried on the injector until it popped out. I used carb cleaner on the outside of each injector and then installed new O-rings. To clean the inside of the injector, I used a cheap Chinese tool I got off the internet, installed the injector, hooked up a 12-volt supply to it, compressed it onto a can of carb cleaner, and then tapped until it cleaned out the injector. This was repeated 7 more times. I then installed the clean injectors back onto the fuel rail and set it off to the side. Continuing to work on the intake manifold, I removed the old gaskets and then cleaned off the surface, first with a razor blade, being careful not to scratch the plastic, and then with some solvent. Next, I lubricated the O-rings of each injector and then installed the fuel rail back onto the intake manifold, and then secured it with the 4 8mm bolts. The hoses for the positive crankcase ventilation were inspected and replaced. As you can see in this one right here, there are some dry cracks. Then I flipped the intake manifold back over and installed the gaskets. Those gaskets are held in by a hole and a pin, and if you get those lined up together, they should click right into place. The same thing was done for the gasket on the other side of the intake manifold. And then the foam was cleaned up and reinstalled on both the front and back of the manifold. I also installed a new throttle body gasket at the same time. We're now ready to install the intake manifold. I was smart this time and got a helper. We bungee corded the wire harness out of the way, cleaned up the mating surfaces, and then carefully worked it into place. This is the same time that my wife got shit all over her fingers, or whatever that is. Now moving on to the coils and plug wires, I was able to clean them up and then install dielectric grease on all the connectors. I carefully removed them into place, attached all the plug wires, and then bolted down the 10mm bolts that attach the coil bracket to the valve cover. The wire harness for each fuel injector was connected, and then the blue plastic locking tab was installed on each one. This was followed up by attaching the large white connector on each side of the engine. At the same time, I also attached the fuel lines. They just clicked into place. And the PCV valve hose was also slid into place, along with the knock sensor wire harness was clipped into its bracket. The 10mm nut holding the wire harness was attached, and the wire harness for the map sensor was also clicked in. Moving to the front, hooked up the purge valve solenoid and installed the 10mm nut holding the harness down. The evap hose was then carried over and fished through the engine from the front to the back. And then I was able to click in the front of the hose onto the purge solenoid, and the rear of the evap hose was then clicked into the hard line. At the rear of the engine block, there are 2 grounding wires that need to be cleaned up. There's one with a white stripe that goes in this location, and the one that is solid black goes into this location right here. And now for the heavy lifting. You're going to want to call a couple friends over to help with this difficult job.
Are you rolling?
Thanks for helping, guys. Now moving on to the right side of the engine, the wire harness needs to be clipped down, and the vacuum line that controls the vent selector should be plugged into the intake manifold. Now moving to the lower front of the engine, Start by attaching the grounding strap and negative battery cable to the block of the engine. The air conditioning bracket is held on by 3 15mm bolts in these locations. The bracket was positioned into place, and then the 3 bolts were torqued down to about 37 foot-pounds. The compressor was carried over and the rear harness was attached, and the compressor was bolted in using the 4 mounting bolts. The wire harness on the side of the compressor was then attached, and then a new seal was placed on the hose that goes up to the accumulator. There's a 13mm nut that attaches this hose to the accumulator, and that is torqued down to 25 foot-pounds. There's a special tool that can be used to attach the harmonic balancer pulley to the crankshaft. I don't have this tool. I've heard of people using a longer bolt off of a different LS engine. What I did, I was careful and tapped it in gently enough where the original crankshaft bolt could be used and grabbed several threads. With my impact wrench set at a low setting, I was able to slowly work on the harmonic balancer pulley until it was mated to the same distance from when I took the original off. While I was in this area of the engine, I decided to install the AC belt. Now moving to the top of the engine, I started by installing the coolant temperature sensor. Next, I replaced the gaskets on the steam lines, carried them over the engine, and then torqued down the 2 bolts to 106 inch-pounds. The clean throttle body was then installed on the new gasket. The nuts were torqued down to 106 inch-pounds. The wire harness was attached to the left side, and the steam vent hose was attached to the right side. I learned a tip from a pro to make installation of the alternator much easier. The metal mounting sleeves need to be pulled through the aluminum bracket in order for the alternator to drop in. This is done by using a socket, a bolt, a nut, and some washers, and compressing it together. This will push that metal sleeve right into where the socket is. And now we're ready to install this bracket. I removed the 15mm bolt on the side of the engine, swung the bracket over, installed the 4 long 15mm bolts in the front and the 1 short one in the back, torqued them down to 37 foot-pounds. I installed the battery cable to the rear of the alternator with the 13mm nut. This is where our hard work paid off. The alternator should just slide right into place. Put the bolts in, and you can reinstall the wire harness. The dipstick and fill tubes are a puzzle. To make it easier, they put a notch on this rubber grommet, and the rubber grommet goes in the valve cover. I highly recommend taking photos of your current tube setup before removing them. It'll help put this puzzle back together. There are 2 15mm bolts that attach the bracket to the head, and then 1 10mm bolt and 1 10mm nut on the bracket itself. Transmission fill tube is snaked from the rear of the engine to the front, and then the tube itself is mated with the lower half on the bottom. There's a 15mm nut that needs to be tightened, and then the pressure relief valve from the transmission can be clipped in. Put a small amount of RTV on the upper half of this dipstick tube, installed it to the lower half, and then attached it with a 10mm nut. A water pump assembly was next. I installed new gaskets on the rear of it, putting all 6 bolts in place, carefully aligning it on the block, and then tightening the 13mm bolts down. This was followed by attaching the heater core hoses on the left side of the water pump assembly. After inspecting the original serpentine belt, I decided it was in good enough shape to reuse. To install the core support with the radiator attached, there are 2 holes in the front of the van that correspond with the tabs on the bottom of the core support. We ended up putting a new radiator in. Warranty for our engine requires that any oil cooler be replaced. Since the oil cooler is integrated in the radiator, we purchased a new radiator. The entire core support is held on by 4 bolts on each side. Next, install a new seal on the hose that goes in the condenser, and install a 13mm nut. Torque it down to 25 foot-pounds. I forgot to do it. Here we're installing the right side of the transmission cooler line. It clicks in with the quick connects, and then the line snaps in. I also installed a new lower radiator hose. This clicks in to the radiator, and then it hooks up to the water pump. and the clamp needs to be tightened down. On the passenger side of the radiator, the transmission cooler line needs to be attached, and on the driver's side, both the upper and lower oil cooler lines need to be attached. These simply get pressed into place, and then the plastic clips retain it. Next, reattach the headlight wire harness to the core support. There should be some plastic wired clips behind it. Then attach the lower fan shroud. This is held on by two 10mm bolts that can be reached from underneath the van. Next, the fan and clutch can be installed on the water pump pulley. Righty-tighty, they used a pipe wrench to tighten it up. The upper fan shroud is held on by six 10mm bolts that connected to the lower fan shroud, and then two 10mm bolts that connected to the core support. The wire harness is clipped to the top of the fan shroud, and then the air conditioning condenser line is roped through the core support, attached to the condenser, and torqued down to 25 foot-pounds with the new seal. We're getting close to the end, and I forgot to film the installation of the upper radiator hose. The air intake is installed with an 8mm band clamp at the throttle body, and then two 10mm bolts that attach it to the core support. The mass airflow sensor is installed, and the wire harness is clipped down. And now we're ready to install the coolant reservoir tank. This is placed in to the two tabs. It's got a 10mm bolt that attaches it to the core support. One hose attaches to the neck of the radiator, and the other drip hose attaches to a spot on the fan shroud. The hood latch is attached with three 10mm bolts. If you look closely on your core support, you can see the dirty spots. Trying to get the bolt holes to line up perfect in the same spot they were before. Your bumper will be attached by two 15mm bolts in each wheel well, and then two, I think they're 21mm bolts on the front. Headlights are installed next. Attach the wire harness, and then install the two 10mm clips, making sure the tabs on the bottom of the headlights are in their proper alignment spots. The grille is attached by lining up carefully, snapping the clips into place, and then installing the four 10mm bolts. Next are the side marker lights. Wire harnesses are installed and they clip into place. Next, the battery is carried over. It is positioned in place, and then there is a 13mm bolt that holds the clamp for keeping the battery in place. There's also a bracket above the battery. It's held in by two 13mm bolts on both the left and the right side of the engine bay. Next, we get to do the annoying process of putting fluids into a van. I wrapped a towel around the oil filler neck, installed a tube with a funnel on it so I can angle it down in there, and then poured in about 5 quarts of oil before checking the level. Next, I did the same with the coolant. I wrapped a towel around the neck of the radiator, put a funnel on there, and then enjoyed the painfully slow process of putting 4 gallons of coolant into a van. Now we're getting close to starting it, but there's still one more step. We're going to pull the fuel pump relay one more time, then we're going to jump into the cab, and we're going to crank it over between 5 and 7 seconds. This will ensure that the oil pump is properly primed. Now we're on the home stretch. To reinstall the doghouse cover, attaching the clips, the vent piece in, reinstall the center console with the 4 10mm bolts. Following that, the right dash panel can be clipped in and then installed with 2 10mm bolts. And then the driver's side dash panel can be installed with the 2 10mm bolts. The seat will be then carried over, reinstalled with the 4 18mm nuts.
Done.
Now the moment we've been waiting for, all the hard work. We're going to jump back in it. What we'll do is we'll start it up. We're going to check the gauges for oil pressure, coolant temperature, and we're going to jump out and make sure nothing's leaking from underneath. I was satisfied that everything was working as it should. For the first 500 miles, I won't go wide open throttle. After that, I'll change the oil, and then it should be good to go. Thanks for watching this 2-part series on how to remove and replace the engine in a Chevy Express van.